remind myself of the parts that are good. Yeah.
All right. Well, I've started the stream. So, hello everyone, and welcome to Watching 100 Movies. I'm Christiana Ellis,
And I'm Mike Mateen.
and today we are talking about the Christopher Nolan's Batman trilogy, which consists of Batman Begins, The Dark Knight, and The Dark Knight Rises. It's our last episode was one of our Oscar updates, and we had kind of intended to do an Oscar wrap up, but it's been long enough that I think we're just moving on to the our new topic of the day, which I just introduced. But it was doing these three movies was your suggestion, Mike. So why not jump into why did you pick these?
I don't. I remember. So it was a big deal. I think when they came on HBO Max, and so I saw that they were being advertised on there. And the impetus for this is I really wanted to watch The Dark Knight again, to see how Heath Ledger's performance kind of holds up. I know, now that we've had sort of different takes on the Joker and the
Mm-hmm.
different characters, and just kind of go back to that, you know, original tour de force that he did and kind of see it again with fresh eyes. And it just made sense that, I hadn't seen the original one in a long time. And I remember that one really captivated me to this group of movies. Like it was a Batman that was so different than I was used to that I just really liked it. Um, and then the fact that he closed it out with such a powerhouse sequel or trilogy, the final movie it's probably the best all-around movie out of the three, I think, in my opinion. And so I kind of knew all of that in my head, but I was thought it'd be fun to kind of go back and watch them, together as opposed to 5 to 10 years apart as we originally came to them, or as we just kind of encounter them as they come on TV or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
To really just kind of dedicate that time and really look at how they were different, how they evolved, what the tone was compared to, the new now that we've got some new Batman and Joker and that type
Mm-hmm.
of stuff. So it just felt right. And I'm glad we did it because I really enjoyed them.
Great. I can tell that just based on your enthusiasm there that I am going to be, by comparison, the naysayer. Which is not to say that I don't like these movies, but I think I am maybe not as glowing on them as you, although I like many things about them for sure. But like for me, I had seen The Dark Knight several times, and certainly had seen that the most recently. But I realized when you suggested this that I had seen Batman Begins and The Dark Knight Rises only once each in the theater and not since then. And
Oh
so I
wow.
thought it was an interesting idea that even though I had seen Dark Knight maybe 4 or 5 times, um, I hadn't seen either of the others since then, and I thought it would be interesting to revisit, which is why I was definitely on board for an episode on these movies. Um, I think, and especially like you're saying, since we've had the Matt Reeves the Batman come out, and we've had the Joker, or rather Joker,
Yep.
and then that's getting a sequel coming up. There's been a lot of, and over the years, there's been a lot of different takes on Batman and the Joker. And um, it's interesting to look at the arc that Christopher Nolan created with his three movies in that broader tapestry.
Yeah.
Um, so, do we want to like discuss them in order? I mean, that maybe makes the most sense.
Yeah, it just gives some structure to the discussion, although we
Sure.
obviously they compare to one another in different reasons, but I
Mm-hmm.
think talking about them in order will allow us to kind of touch on those things. Yeah.
Right. Like, because uh, certainly that's where we can kind of track the developing trend of the three, right? Um, and I think one of the things that was really striking to me going back to Batman Begins for the first time is how it's really the only one of the three that makes any effort at all, I think, to making Gotham seem like a comic book place instead of just, you know, Chicago with a different light filter on it. Which I don't even necessarily mean as a criticism, because he's obviously doing it on purpose. I think he decided with the two sequels that he was wanting it to feel more like a real city and not like a comic book city, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of even just the outside of just Gotham, but just the kind of the cinematography, the blocking, whatever
Mm-hmm.
you want to call it, just the screenshot, the shot choices, like the whole movie feels much more like a live action comic, but like a live action dark comic book,
Mm-hmm.
right? Than the other two. The other two are a little bit more pure thriller action, right?
Right. And so I'm even talking just about like the what the city looks like when we get the long shots, because you've got like actual plot points with the whole like elevated train and the sort of gothic design of the towers and the way the neighborhood of the Narrows looks.
Oh
Um,
yeah. Well, I
all
100% agree with that, all
Yeah.
of that. I'm saying
Hmm.
even in addition to that, just some of the like you could take a lot of screenshots out of this and they look like comic book panels, even
Yeah.
in addition to what Gotham looked
I
like.
will say that I think that was actually my favorite aspect of going back to Batman Begins. And I think just for my own personal taste, I kind of prefer that to the approach of trying to make it just feel more like a big city that might be in our real world instead of a comic book city. Which, I mean, it's a totally fair approach. Obviously, he can make the movies however he wants, but I feel like between the two, I kind of liked it when it was a more comic book city.
Yeah, that's probably one of my favorite parts about that, as well as I just I just think he nails sort of the origin story, right? And
Mm-hmm.
and but the way he kind of makes it more like this ninjutsu thing, and like, and there's these
Yeah.
trials to get there, and it's just I don't know, it feels so cool that he's like earning the right to be this badass, right?
Well,
And-
right. Like it seems like a really big part of what he's trying to accomplish in Batman Begins is to try to think through what would a person actually need to do in order to try to be Batman? Like, what does it take for a real person rather than a comic book character to obtain the skills necessary, the gear necessary? Like, because even being rich is not really enough by itself because it has to be secret also, right? And so, like the whole sequence where he's working with Lucius Fox and Alfred, and they're having to like source different parts of the cowl from different countries so that no one would be able to say, "Hey, wait a minute, this is that product from this place. Can we trace that purchase or whatever?" Right? And like doing all of that sort of thing. Although I think the Tumbler, the Batmobile, looks very cool. I love the design. Probably a harder sell in that regard because it's a very specific look. It's hard to imagine that there wouldn't be people who would just say, "Hey, wait a minute, I worked on that thing.
yeah.
Where did that come from?" They just
Right.
painted it black. Although
Exactly.
"does it come in black" is a good line.
Yes.
Um, but yeah, so it seems very clear that that is part of what Nolan is trying to do with Batman Begins. And I think developing that idea is part of why he ends up making the city look more grounded instead of more fantastical in the later movies. But I did really like revisiting that aspect of it, and even going up and discovering the League of Shadows. Right, like it's still pretty comic booky to say that there's a secret league of ninjas living up in this fortress in the mountains of
Yes.
Kathmandu or wherever they are. Um,
Like that's even some of the ones I'm picturing. Like when you're talking, like yes, the Gotham wide shot looks like a comic book panel, but so does the shot of him climbing the mountain and like plucking the flower, right? Like it's
yeah.
just the way that's even just framed. Like you could see that as a drawing, as a
Hmm.
panel, right?
Yeah. Well, because the thing is, it's like when Batman Begins came out, I'm trying to think about what were the other superhero movies like at the time. Because I don't think we really had. Let's see, Batman Begins comes out in 2005. which is still 3 years before Iron Man, with the first of the beginning of the MCU as we know it now. And I think compared to other superhero movies that had come out before then, whether it's the Raimi Spider-Man movies or the previous Batman films, certainly the idea of a grounded, how realistic can we get away with making a superhero story is not really an approach that we had seen people even try before. And so even though it still has a lot of comic booky elements to it, in the context of what superhero movies were at that time, it's very grounded. Because, for example, Raj Al Ghul, the character that we discover is actually Liam Neeson's character and not the guy that we think it is originally. I mean, in the comics, this is a guy who has these special weird glowing green swimming pools called Lazarus pits that he goes in that makes him live to be hundreds and hundreds of years old, and there's all this supernatural occult magic stuff associated with that character. But they wanted to use Raj Al Ghul, but they strip all of that away, right? Like, and they still have him kind of. It's a little bit of still of a comic booky approach. The idea that somehow he thinks making Gotham eat itself will accomplish something, I guess. Like that's I think what exactly the League of Shadows wants, I think, is probably my least favorite part of the whole trilogy. It comes back into play in Rises, but we'll get there. But the point is that we take that character and we make him work without having to rely on all of the supernatural elements of it.
Exactly. Well, and the other piece to it is that it also doesn't it it, it posits that like you can't just be Batman because of the technology,
Mm-hmm.
right? You just can't be a guy who puts on this like super suit
Yeah.
and do all the things that he does, right? Like he has to be like kind of a badass to begin with,
Mm-hmm.
and that sort of kind of goes and like it kind of grows through the story too, right?
Mm-hmm.
So by Dark Knight Rises, like he's injured, so he's having to like supplement himself with even more technology, and so he's
Mm-hmm.
becoming like the technology Batman, but he still has the skill set underneath, right?
Right.
That's
I
the
really
basic
like that
skill.
as a theme throughout of him constantly iterating on his gear,
Yeah.
trying new things, solving new problems as they arise, trying a bit of gear that turns out it's like, well, I don't know, maybe that was a neat idea that didn't actually work like we thought, so we don't have to keep going with that one. Like in the beginning of Dark Knight, where he has that thing that like the can opener on his gauntlet trying to cut through the side of the van, and it's like, well, it kind of worked, but then they just ran him into a pillar, and it was like maybe it's not worth the weight on your arm.
Yeah.
um, but I love that through line of him iterating on that stuff right up until the point where in Rises he's having to is like, this is my bat knee brace.
Yeah.
um, but I like that part of it. But one of the other great themes that I think develops in Batman Begins is showing all of these multiple sources for the ideas that eventually get synthesized into what Batman is. And it includes Thomas Wayne saying, why do we fall so that we can get back up again? And his wanting to make the city a better place. We have, the lessons from Raj Al Ghul about like, you have to be a symbol, working with fear as your skill, but also knowing where to stop following that path. And then Alfred, I'm forgetting the specific example, but Alfred said something early on in this one that became a big resonating piece, and I'm forgetting it at the moment. But I just remember while watching it, seeing him get these little nuggets of advice from all of these different sources that we see him assembling into what Batman is.
Yeah. Well, yeah, he because he learns. You're right. Like I can't remember exactly. I was trying to think of it too. You know, he learns obviously something from his dad, something from Ra's al Ghul,
Yeah.
something from Mike Alfred, something
From
from
Gordon.
Rachel.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. Like
and
all of these.
Gordon.
Yeah.
Yeah, they all have, and you're right. It's like it's not overly dramatic in like, oh, this is like the thing. Like other the Thomas Wayne one is a little bit like that, right? Because it like
Mm-hmm.
resonates in his head a couple of times. But
Yeah.
the other ones, like you see him like kind of internalize these lines, but they're not like hammering it on you. Like it's just
Mm-hmm.
really well crafted, right? But you're right. That point is really fun to see him evolve and and just like just the way that like he kind of transforms into this person he wants to be based on what all these people have told him.
Mm-hmm.
Like he's you see him kind of like trying to like he wasn't like when he's being the playboy and he's doing that as a front, and then
Mm-hmm.
like Rich just like cuts him to the bone of like I don't I don't want to be your friend anymore, basically,
Yeah.
to the extent like if this is who you are now, like I'm not your friend.
Mm-hmm.
It's like then he just sort of he realizes the downside of like putting on too much of a show
Mm-hmm.
in the Playboy, billionaire. He's like,
Yeah.
well, he's like, I still have to have this front, but like it doesn't have to be so ridiculous that it's like not who I am,
Right.
right?
Although he never
Then comes
really does make that work because, by the time it's part three, he's a recluse for 7 years.
Well, that's what I was saying. That's
Yeah.
where it comes back, right? Is that
Mm-hmm.
it's like that's like the yin and the yang, right? Like so in the beginning he's like this super he's going to all the parties and he's with the
Mm-hmm.
girls and he's like too far that direction. Then by the third one, yeah, he's living in the mansion alone as a recluse, and he's not seeing anybody. And it's like
Mm-hmm.
that's not good either, right? Like he needs to
Yeah.
get back to that like in the middle where it's like I am Bruce Wayne. I am this billionaire. I am charismatic. I am out at these things, but
Mm-hmm.
I'm really also this guy, right? Like, and it's I think the way when you watch them all together and you kind of see that it's kind of fun.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I like, from a villain standpoint, that we establish Liam Neeson's character, even though we don't realize that he is in fact Raj Al Ghul until later. But we establish that character and that sort of ideology. That he was trained by them, but then once he realizes, no, I'm
Shut
not.
the door quick.
Okay,
You can keep talking. I'm just gonna shut a
I'm
door.
not willing to go as far as they are, even if that means violently resisting them. Um, and that's kind of in the background because then, we get back to Gotham and we're dealing with Maroni, the mob, right? And then we also have the Scarecrow, Dr. Crane, and they're working together. But I like the moving pieces of the two of them working together, clearly having some interests aligned, but each of them ultimately having competing priorities, and yet both of them theoretically also working for this larger, darker conspiracy that neither of them especially care about, except that they think they can get something out of it, right? I like that each of those pieces has their own thing. Like, even when they're working together in a conspiracy, they don't like each other, they don't want the same things. But for now, we're working together until I'm going to find some way to backstab the rest of you and get on top myself. But every one of them has that unspoken piece of everything they say to each other.
Right.
I like that stuff. And then, I think having this all just be, um, I like to, we haven't really mentioned Gordon yet, except just like I kind of just name dropped him a little bit earlier, but Gary Oldman, who in the first, like, he doesn't even become Commissioner Gordon until the end of the second movie, right? Like, but I like having him also be earlier in his career as Batman is developing his whole thing.
Yep.
I like that aspect of it. I think Gary Oldman's great in the role, even though it's not an especially flashy role in any of the three. Um, I I thought it was a very strange decision to have him be hunched over in a hospital bed for most of Rises. Personally, I think that's a weird call, but um, uh,
Well, I think it my guess from that was that it's all part of like leaving the door open had he wanted to make or have somebody make a fourth version because
mhm,
obviously there's like the one kid that could become Robin and
yeah,
it's like well Gary Oldman probably said he was done no matter what and so it was like
mhm.
kind of getting him moving out of the picture and having other kind of people
Yeah.
be who would take that on. That's what I
Well,
guessed at.
I feel too that like I think part of what that movie is going for, we'll get talk more about it when we get there, is trying to build in this sense of what's been happening can't go on forever. And
Right.
this is going to be the big last, whatever this is, however it turns out, that's going to be the end of it
Right.
for now, or is it, right? But like that fear that that'll be the end of it. Like
Yes.
if we don't make it work this time, we won't get to try again.
Right.
That sort of thing. But I like the moment of Gordon putting the coat around. Because, of course, it's become a cliche at this point that every Batman movie needs to. Because I forgot I didn't even mention like the Justice League, the Ben Affleck Batman, Man versus, Superman versus Batman. I didn't even mention those that came in between since this trilogy. But yeah, just like we've had so many different movies feel the need to show us the same Batman origin, the attack in Crime Alley. But if it wasn't such a cliche, I don't think, when this one came out. And I think it all happens pretty fast, like in keeping with a lot of the rest of it. It's not quite made so operatic. Even though aren't they literally went to an opera, I think,
Yes.
which is interesting given that the actual crime scene is a lot less is staged a lot less operatically than say the Burton ones,
Yep.
or for that matter the Snyder ones. But I think part of the reason that he put the opera in there is because it's Deflator Mouse is like it's a real opera, and there's like there's a guy in a big costume.
Yeah, it made sense that it would be scary for a kid who has a fear of bats.
Yeah, yeah. Also, a thing that a very rich family would do would be going to in the city. But also, for that matter, the idea of giving him a little extra guilt of they left early and went out a side exit because Bruce was scared. And we get some nice stuff with Thomas Wayne, who's like not only recognizes that and has taken care of him, but also like gives an excuse to the mom so that the kid doesn't have to feel embarrassed. Like that's some good stuff, but then it also gives Bruce that extra layer of we were only there in that alley at that moment because I was afraid.
Doesn't mean, yeah.
Yeah. And having all of that, the fear element, ties all the way through it because that's of course that's the weapon of the League of Shadows. It's also the Scarecrow's whole deal. I like the Scarecrow as you know, the mask is essentially just a combo gas mask to protect him from his own stuff, and also, I'm trying to make people have hallucinations to scare them. So let's just it's like it's a bad trip tool.
Yeah.
um,
Well, it's almost like a blank canvas, right?
mhm.
Because you kind of can hallucinate on like whatever because
Yeah,
it's so
it's like it disrupts the ability to read the face enough that it sends your brain spiraling when
yeah.
you're under the influence of this drug. Um, I like, I mean, Killian Murphy has done a lot of cool stuff since then. Obviously, he just won an Oscar for another Nolan movie. But like he's fun in this, and we were talking earlier about like the fun tension between him and Maroney. Tom Wilkinson is, it's funny. I don't think of Tom Wilkinson in this kind of role. I think of him usually as a more like avuncular, sort of grandfatherly guy
Yep.
instead of this mob asshole. um, I will say that I spent about the first 2/3 of this movie saying, wow, this is a lot better than I remembered. And then the last act saying, oh, right, this was why.
I agree with you too. I've always enjoyed the first half to two-thirds way
Mm-hmm.
more than kind of the conclusion of the movie.
Yeah.
Especially like I said, that's why I even mentioned like the origin part, like that first third, for lack of a better,
Mm-hmm.
terminology, is just so good, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
climbing the mountain to the secret assassin temple to train like a ninja,
Yeah.
and all that part is just so cool.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just like figuring out the gear, making the mask, all the way up to his first real outing in the costume. There's some great lines in there. I tell you, the criminal going, "I swear to God," and him saying, "Swear to me." I think is one of my favorite Batman lines in all of the any of the movies that he's been
Yeah.
in. I will say I like uh, it became a joke for a reason. I think his Batman voice is nicely understated here and gets a little silly in the following ones. But I think it works really well here. It feels like it sounds like that because he's shouting, not because he's doing a voice.
Yeah. Well,
Now,
and it's
yeah.
yeah, I mean, and it's just it is it's so dramatic by the time you get to Dark Knight Rises because he's competing with Tom Hardy
Yeah.
in the mask
I
thing, and
I
it's like,
will say it's silly, but Tom Hardy's Bane voice is one of my favorite things about that movie. I
oh
adore
yeah,
his Bane voice. It's incredible.
hold on real quick, I have to answer a question.
Okay. So, um I think well, I don't know if he's going to hear me, but the I think that that whole sequence where he's out there and he's grabbing the thugs, and we haven't even gotten a good look at him in the costume yet, and sort of the reveal of him in the full outfit is kind of presented as the way that the criminals would have seen him, which is the first few little bits. It's only a little glimpse here, a little peek there, and then finally we get the full reveal. And like all of that stuff I think just works like gangbusters.
Yeah,
And even though I don't hate Liam Neeson showing back up to be Raj Al Ghul, I don't think that's a bad story decision or anything. I do think that that's kind of the turning point of the movie where it stops feeling quite so effective to me.
yes,
And I think a big part of that is because it's really like for a movie that had been so grounded up to that point, um, the we're putting all the drug in the water supply, but then we have to use the fancy gizmo to vaporize it, but also apparently not do anything else. And that will make everybody hallucinate, but we have to carry it around on a train to move. Like, that's some comic book bullshit, man. I mean, that's pretty ridiculous. For a movie that had been so grounded up to that point, that gets really silly very fast, and I think it's disruptive to the tone the movie's
I
trying to
agree.
do.
Yeah,
Um, because like it's one thing to say you have a fancy microwave generator that can flash boil water, sure, but you're going to do it from an elevated train through layers of metal and concrete and it doesn't do anything except vaporize already pressurized water in pipes. Physics doesn't work like that, man. It's just not. It's just like it's so frustrating to have the story be so grounded and then get so silly without any kind of like wink or anything. Like, and it's also again just like even if we want to accept Raj's explanation for what the League of Shadows wants, they seem like they're going to a lot of trouble to like screw over Gotham specifically for reasons that are never very clear.
Yeah.
And it honestly is only worse in the third movie. um, but I, but
Yeah, but
that
there's just so much to that to outweigh that in the third movie.
oh
But
well,
we'll
I'm
get
look. I'm not. I have things that I like about the third movie, and we'll get there. But I'm just saying that I feel like they put an awful lot of narrative weight on an explanation that just doesn't make any sense to me.
right. And that's where I was kind of going with where that why that differs in the third movie is
Mm-hmm.
because that is sort of almost like the MacGuffin in that movie, right? Like the
Yeah.
movie works without like the explanation is just like, hey, we needed something to like
Mm-hmm.
get all these people into this situation.
I yeah, I think it's maybe jumping ahead a little bit, but I like the Talia reveal in Rises. I think it comes too late in the movie. I think it's effective when it happens, but by the time it does, we don't like. We knew something was coming with her because she was too nothing of a character to be in the movie as much as she was up to that point. And then she doesn't really get to do very much once the reveal happens. And so, like,
I can see that. Yeah.
so I like the concept of the reveal. I don't think the actress plays it poorly or anything, but I think just story structure wise, it doesn't give that plot room to breathe or really do anything.
Yeah, I could see that for sure. But yeah, you're right though. I
There,
probably forget it a little because it is so effective. Like particularly for me, is that they'd been building this narrative that like when it all of a sudden you like have to like flip your mind around like that
yeah.
she's the one that escaped.
I love that
That
part.
part is
I love
awesome,
that part
right?
about it. You know what? Let's not get too ahead of ourselves there.
It's
I know
fine.
I jumped us there, but we'll
It's
get to
fine.
that. So
Let's go back.
what
Yeah.
else do we want to say about Batman Begins? I will say, like, I think we're on the same page that the final act is the weakest of the
Right.
movie. They had established a lot of points, and they do a good enough job, even though the actual mechanics of the why the machine works that way is nonsense. They at least do well enough explaining it that we understand like what is it that we need to do to stop them. We need to stop
Right.
the train from getting to Wayne Tower, right? Like that's established well enough that we can even if it doesn't make any larger sense, we know what needs to happen. We understand the stakes. So that works well enough. Um, I think the big moment that they build to though with Batman and Raj of like I'm not going to kill you, but I don't need to save you. I feel like it feels like they're trying to have that be a big banger line, kind of like the swear to me line, but I feel like it just comes out like a fart because it's so bogus in my opinion.
Yeah.
Like
That's fair too. Yeah.
I it's I'm maybe overstating the case, but at the same time I feel like if the it's one thing if you want to take like the Snyder's route and say, sure, Batman kills people. Of course he does. He would have to do the things he does. And to say, okay, well, I don't necessarily like that, but at least it's a coherent worldview, right? It's
Right.
another thing to say Batman does not kill people. He's very diligent about that. It's part of how he separates himself from the criminals he's fighting, right? But this stuff about like, well, I want you to be dead and I have put you in a situation that's going to kill you and then I'm not going to rescue you from it, but that doesn't count as me killing you because I didn't like punch you in the face till you were dead.
Yeah. So that I I I agree with what you're saying. Where I think it's more interesting to watch all these movies together
Mm-hmm.
is did he have that as part like was this all part of the like is that part of the whole story, right? Because he then eventually kind of goes to where he's actually killing people, right? Like,
Well, it's interesting because, for example, he does not kill the Joker, even though we don't see him again, obvious for obvious reasons, because Heath Ledger died and they didn't want to recast him, which I think was the right decision. But he sort of very distinctly not only doesn't kill the Joker, but does save him.
yes,
Right? Joker is falling off the building, and he uses his grappling thing to get him and stop him from falling to his death. Which ironically I don't know. I guess I don't know. It's not obvious that he would have been able to do that for Harvey Dent, even if he had wanted to. But he also doesn't really try.
right.
Actually, I guess that's not true because he's holding him up right at the very end there. Like he
Yeah.
does try to save him. Okay, so I overstated the case there. Because Dent falls, I think, because he makes himself fall, if I recall correctly. Um,
Now you've got me
Yeah, I can't.
confused.
I'm trying to remember. So what I'll also, I guess, what I was going to get to, if we're maybe ready to transition to the Dark Knight, which
Yeah.
is, in my opinion, it's my favorite of the three by fairly wide margin, I think. But I will also say it's because Heath Ledger's stuff is just so transcendent that it elevates everything that he's in, and then once he is out of the movie, I think the rest of it's not very good, in my opinion. I think that the Dent stuff doesn't really work very well for me. And I also think that the big point at the end, like this whole big speech of like, not the hero we need, but the one we deserve, or the one, like, what does that even mean? Like, no one can even quote it properly because it doesn't make any sense. Like, what, like, I, you can kind of get there for what he's trying to say, but it's just such a weird sort of mushy concept and not explained very well that they kind of try to make be the big thesis of the movie at the end. And then at the beginning of the next movie, they undercut it and basically say it was the wrong thing to do. So it's weird, especially in context with the third movie, that the third movie basically begins with them saying, "Yeah, what we did at the end of the second movie was bad. We should not have done that." And I'm not even saying Nolan is saying that. I'm saying the characters are saying that about what they did.
Hmm.
Um, and I think that's interesting because I've not heard Nolan speak on this, but I am curious about why he chose to end the movie on that thesis point, only to then begin the next one essentially saying that was the wrong thing to do.
Yeah, I don't, it's hard to know because of a lot of the things that happened. Like, is this part of like a broader thing that like there was a reason why he was trying to do that and like that's sort of a setup into the third movie? Or was the intention that the third movie would be different had Heath Ledger been around? Like, would he have had a return? Maybe that had a different. There was a different way it
Yeah.
was going to go. It's hard to know, right? And I think all of your criticisms like are totally valid, and I think that's to just sort of explain at the beginning like why I'm so much more glowing on these
Yeah.
movies is that I feel like I'm just more
Well,
forgiving of them,
I
right?
also I think just naturally in conversation, because it's the point of contention such as it is, I'm maybe over focusing on those elements. Let me be clear. Like Dark Knight is my favorite of the three. I think the stuff that works in it is so good that it is the peak of the series, in my opinion. And
Yep.
that's not just a relative peak. I mean, I think it's really incredible, because especially since, although we have had many different takes on the Joker over the years, what Heath Ledger was doing at the time was so unexpected and such a departure from any previous depiction of the Joker that when early set photos were coming out of Heath Ledger in costume with the makeup, people were horrified. It's like, what? What are they doing with the Joker? They're gonna ruin it. And then of course it comes out and it's just incredible. And I mean, so much of that, I mean, obviously we have to give some credit to the conception of the character that comes from the, Nolan and the, the writers and all of that element to it. But Heath Ledger is just so amazing in that movie, you know.
Oh yeah, I agree with you, and I I also really like this movie. I mean, and I can get into when we get to it, so we don't
Hmm.
detract of why I believe the third one is so
Sure.
much better in my opinion.
Fair.
But just to kind of go along the lines of what you've been doing, like to sort of overstate something that I don't really feel as
Okay.
strongly
Fair.
about.
Yeah.
Like one of the things that I used to believe worked really well that didn't resonate as well with me this time
Hmm.
was the um, game theory piece with the
Yeah.
two. Like I remember that being like so dramatic and like oh my god, like and in this it was like
Do you mean the two boats, or do you mean the Dent and um Rachel in separate places, separate bombs?
no, the two boats where
Okay,
they're
sure, sure.
like
Yeah.
where it's like if you kill everybody over there, then you know the
Mm-hmm.
that piece, right? Like if you
Yeah.
blow up that boat before the certain time, then this happens, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like the whole, you know, that was meant to be a very and it still works, right? Like the
Mm-hmm.
game theory of like
Yeah,
what would you do in that
it's
situation? Like these guys are all convicts, and that's blame. Well, we're already convicts, so we can do this. Like the
yeah.
concept that they were building to, like in theory, really works. But when you kind of like sit back and watch and like, there is no way that that is how that thing would have gone down, right? Like how
I
it ends.
yeah, I
Right.
I agree. I think a lot of what happens there is pretty contrived.
Right.
Um I have always thought, like, we get to the big scene where we've got the loudmouth guy on the civilian boat who says, "I'm going to do it. I'll do it. I'll do it." And they give him the thing and then he just can't make himself turn a key. Really? After all
Yeah.
that talk, he can't just go dunk. Like, this is the sort of thing, like, and every time you have a movie where someone's just like, they can't bear to become a killer, it's just too hard to pull the trigger or something, I sort of feel like, I don't think that's real life. I mean, it's one thing, like, I don't want to kill anybody, but I feel like if I wanted to kill someone, I don't think I would find it so hard to pull the trigger that that's what, like, and I don't even mean like literally physically hard. I just mean that it it is a recurring thing in a lot of movies where you have someone who, like, they're gonna do it and they just can't make themselves do it because it would be like crossing a line that they can't cross. And I'm just thinking, I feel like it would be really easy to just go ahead and pull the trigger and then regret it in real life. I think that's probably how it goes way more often than you have people who chicken out actually pulling the trigger or pressing the button or whatever.
That is correct. That is probably more what likely what happens in real life is because it is easy to pull a trigger,
Yeah.
but I don't mind in the right context
Mm-hmm.
the point that it's trying to make that talking about something and doing something
Yes, I, I
very different.
I
Yeah.
agree. And so I guess
It, and but it depends on the movie and the situation, right? Yeah.
I will certainly agree that sequence, I think it's one thing when you have the suspense the first time of not knowing what's going to happen. But once you've seen it once and you do know how it turns out, it does feel on repeat viewings like it takes a long time to get there, and there's a lot of business that turns out to not really matter.
Yeah. Well, and then and the other side of it too. So there's that half of it, and then the
Mm-hmm.
other half where he grabs it and he says, "I'm gonna do what we should have done. You should have done from the beginning," and then
Mm-hmm.
throws it out the window. And it's
Yeah.
like, I okay, it was dramatic, and like to your point, when
Yeah.
you watch it the first time, like all of that is so like,
Mm-hmm.
oh my gosh, like so much tension. And so I that's why I tell like that part really worked. But on
Mm-hmm.
repeat viewings, you're right. There's just like this wouldn't have gone down this way,
Mm-hmm.
and I know what's going to happen, so all the tension things are lost on me.
Well, the other thing that um, actually, I take this back. What I was about to say is the setup, as explained by the Joker, is that if neither boat sets off the other's bomb, they will both blow up, right? Which is revealed to be a lie because neither of them do it and neither boat blows up. Now,
Right.
it does, I was about to say, why wouldn't he have followed through on that? But on the second hand, I do imagine what he is expecting to have happen is for one boat to blow up the other, and then for it to be revealed, oh, wait, actually, it wouldn't have. And so you did it when you didn't need to,
Right.
right?
That's exactly what is supposed to have happened. Yeah.
Yeah. It actually reminds me a little bit. I was just arguing with someone online again about this because it's something I cannot let go of, which is the end of the movie version of The Mist, which just drives me up the wall. I cannot stand the ending of the movie. Um, which I don't know if we need to even get into it because
I feel
I
like we did recently already.
I know it's something I feel like I can't let go of it. So anytime even something even remotely reminds me of it, it just boils my blood a little bit.
Yeah.
So
Well, go back and
let's
listen to a
not get
few of
into
our
that.
other episodes.
Yeah, let's not get
This was
back into that.
explained at one point. I don't remember which episode or
Yeah,
how you got there, but you definitely told me
I
about this
it
very
is.
recently.
I think usually I find myself on the side of not wanting to tell people not to like things and trying to find the best in something even when I don't necessarily enjoy it. But there's a couple of movies that I cannot let it slide. Anyway, that's not what we're talking about right now. We're talking about Dark Knight. Um, I think that that's an example, though, of certainly that's part of the Joker's plan, but it's also like he's not there, right? I think so much of the Joker stuff works here, not even necessarily just on the script level, but just literally by how magnetic Ledger's performance is. When he's on
Yes.
screen, he sells it. When it's his stuff, but he's not physically present, it's weaker by comparison.
Hmm.
Um, and I think that he just does a lot of fun stuff and he rides the balance so well of like staying mysterious as far as like what his actual deal is, like what is it that he really wants and that sort of thing. um Alfred's like, I think people make too much of Alfred's line where he says some men just want to watch the world burn, which I'm not saying he's wrong. But I think too many people take that as the movie's making a statement that that is definitively what the Joker's deal is. I
Right.
think that's an overstatement, too. You know, I don't think that that's even necessarily what the movie's trying to say.
Right.
Um, but I like better Joker's speech to Dent at the hospital, where he's just like, I'm just a dog chasing cars. I wouldn't know what to do with it if I caught it. Um, and so it's not even like he wants the world to burn as much as he likes setting fires.
Yep. That's good. I like that. Yeah.
Um, because, like, and I think it's almost a specific contrast given that the first and third movies both deal with the League of Shadows, where their whole deal actually really is more along the lines of saying the world does need to burn, right? Whereas Joker is more just kind of like, I'm just doing stuff. I want to see what happens. Like he literally, at one point in the movie, says, "I Batman does have to step forward," and then later in the movie, he says, "I've changed my mind. Now I don't want anyone to know who he is." And it's because he's just like, he's just running with it as he goes, and um, I like him tricking, or not even really a trick, but basically working with the mob to get to the point where he literally has all of their cash in a great big pile. And the promise was, we get it all here and I get half of it. But then what he does is he just sets fire to the whole big mountain of it and he says, "Don't worry, I'm only burning my half." It's just that's such a great sort of bit just to kind of, and he, as he says in that scene, the things I like: gasoline, gunpowder, The great thing about them is that they're cheap. And just the illustrating the point of like, I don't care about all this money. I just think it's funny to take it away from you.
Yes.
I don't need it.
Yeah.
So I just think that his take on the character, in addition to just being fascinating whenever he's on screen generally, I think is just such a perfect foil to Bale's version of Batman in these movies.
Right. Where he like takes himself so seriously.
Yeah,
Right.
it is all important is that he is having to do all of this really hard stuff because it matters what he does and it's important and he has to try to do it to make the world a better place, even though he's taking such extreme measures that many people would say he must be crazy to do it. Right? Whereas then you have Joker just saying, you're tying yourself in knots because you're trying to pretend that all of this has meaning instead of just doing it because you want to do it.
Yeah.
And I think that those two viewpoints are fascinating to watch clash. And it's like, it's why that interrogation scene is so good.
Right. Like that's I mean, probably the most famous line in the movie, you know? Why so serious?
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Mm-hmm. And, we get the inspired choice of him uh, telling a different story every time. He likes to ask people, how I got these scars, but then it's just a different story every time.
Yeah.
That's such a great choice. And I think there's such a great portrayal of him as like you can't get a step ahead of him because he really does legitimately change his mind about what he wants on a whim constantly. And
Yeah.
so even when he's got this really complicated plan that he's set up, he'll throw it away in a heartbeat if he thinks it's something more interesting.
Well, yes, and that is the one part where, so I was gonna we kind of went away from the boat game theory
Mm-hmm.
thing, but that was what I was gonna say, like kind of to conclude that is the reason I do still like that in there
Mm-hmm.
is because that's more of like classic game theory, right? Like trolley problem, like that, all that kind of stuff, right? Like it's
Mm-hmm.
similar to all those things in threads. But what the Joker is like impossible game theory, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because you cannot predict what he's going to do.
Mm-hmm.
Like he's gamed game theory,
Yeah.
right?
I think that it was like the theme of pairing that against the eventual Two Faces approach. There's almost something there that I feel like they don't quite ever really compare the two, right? Because it's Joker's speech that ultimately kind of inspires Harvey Dent to start using the coin that way, right? Because I will say, I think that the use of the coin throughout is pretty good. Like, I
Yeah.
think that works where he keeps flipping the coin with all these important decisions and then winning the coin toss and people are just like, you're letting such an important decision go according to chance. And of course the reveal is that he's not because it's a trick coin.
Yeah.
And I think that that's fun. But then of course, once Joker is basically telling him, uh, see, I think the problem that I have ultimately is that they don't sell Harvey Dent's real dark side to us well enough before it feels like he's just crazy because he got half his face blown off.
Yes, I agree with that. Yeah.
Um, because there's a scene where he is got the Joker in a van and like drives him to the tunnel, or it's not even the Joker; it's one of his guys, right?
Yep.
Um, and like Batman has to show up to stop him, but like I don't feel like they sell that thematically as much as they need to.
I agree. Yeah.
Um, I feel like we need before he gets burned to have more of an understanding because like the idea that he has his nickname of Two-Face because he worked in internal affairs, like it feels like a grounded reason why he might have the nickname of Two-Face, but it doesn't say anything about who he is actually really.
Right.
It doesn't suggest at any point like he really does have these two sides to him.
Yep.
Um, and I feel like the movie kind of wants it both ways because it wants him simultaneously to be, for it to be horrifically sad that this guy who really was the best of them, even he could not withstand this and fell as a result. But then they kind of also want there to have been a real dark side that just got brought out. And they kind of can't really commit to either, and it ends up not being solidly one or the other. And it doesn't help that the whole bit where they're trying to sell us on what is it that we're supposed to think about this at the end, and the idea that we're going to have Batman take the credit for the murders so that Harvey Dent doesn't get impugned. But okay. I just, yeah. And again, it's like, we kind of touched on earlier, it's just strange to make the movie end that way and then have the next movie, which is like 6 years later, basically recontextualize all of that. But um, so I think with the Dark Knight, I think it's got some. I think the action is. The action is not bad in part three, but I think the action might be the best in Dark Knight, in my opinion. I'll say one thing. I'll say we didn't touch on this in Batman Begins. Fight choreography is rough compared to where it goes later. Now, in fairness to Christopher Nolan, this was his first like action movie. I mean, I think the closest to an action movie he had made before that was like Memento or something like that, which is such a weird setup and all that. But like certainly by the context of like modern standards, you watch the fight choreography in Batman Begins and it's very clumsy by comparison. I think it's really pretty good in Dark Knight, and I think that whole freeway tunnel car chase sequence is pretty incredible.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. I like the action in Dark Knight Rises a lot.
Yeah. I'm not
It
trying to impugn it. I'm just trying
it,
to think of a sequence that I thought was as good as that.
there's not really anything as good as that, and that is like one of, outside of some of the things I already covered as we sort
Mm-hmm.
of transition into Dark Knight Rises soon,
Mm-hmm.
is it does use the budget and the technology that it has access to make, like, because the opening scene with the plane
Mm-hmm.
is pretty impressive, but it is also pretty impressive because for two reasons. The technology that allows them to do this ridiculous thing where they hook this plane to another plane and like all that, and then just the sheer like presence of Tom Hardy, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, and just how he he owns scenes in a different way than Heath
Mm-hmm.
Ledger did, but like I don't know. I'm not going to say his performance is better because Heath
Well,
Ledger's, like you said, was transcendent, but
yeah.
it was, as far as like just, I mean, yes, Heath Ledger owned every moment he was in, but like
Mm-hmm.
Bane like owns like
I
everything in attention when
so
he's on the screen.
I think we can maybe go ahead and move
Yeah,
into Dark Knight Rises. And here's like my take on Bane is Tom Hardy is incredibly magnetic on screen. And even wearing that weird mask, just his voice and his mannerisms and his charisma on screen is so good that it goes a long way towards making up for the fact that the movie's own script doesn't really know who he is. Like, even though we were talking about like different sort of takes on what the Joker's philosophy was, what is Bane's philosophy?
just to be a badass.
I guess.
But see, that's the thing, like, and then that's probably why I like this movie so much more than you, is that
Mm.
it, and this is like was a really hard thing to kind of like admit when I was trying to think like, why do I like this so much? Like it's
Well, you
weird,
know what? I want you to sell me on it. Tell me, yeah.
but it's not going to sell you on it
Well,
because
well, okay, fair
it's an
enough.
internal thing. It's going to sell
Yeah.
you on why
Well,
I like it so
I,
much. Is
I
that
I would like to hear you talk about what you like about it.
so Heath Ledger, as great as he is, and as like you said, all those
Hmm.
things, and I agree with all of that. Like that's not like that's that he's a pure villain, right? The
Hmm.
thing that's like complicated and compelling about Bane is like that when I watch it, it's like if I was gonna be a villain, kind of want to be him, right? And it's like
Hmm.
a weird feeling, like I kind of want to be the bad guy in this one
Hmm.
because he's like he's not having to have like the artificial knee and all this kind of stuff. And that's part of why I think that reveal with that it's not him that escapes, but it's Talia is
Hmm.
like you think that he has this really cool origin story and like you're just like you have this whole push pull or I have this whole push pull the whole time
Hmm.
of like no he's the bad guy I know but man he's so cool and he's like he's charismatic, he's big
Hmm.
and strong, like he gets what he wants, like it's a very like lack of a better term, like he's just like the ultimate alpha male, right? And
Hmm.
it's like that's compelling,
Hmm.
and yet you feel weird that you're like compelled to like I feel weird that I'm like compelled to be like the alpha male badass bad
Yeah,
guy,
sure.
right?
Hmm.
And it's like no, I'm supposed to be rooting for the other guy, right? Like because he's the guy who's right. And that sort of like dichotomy like
Hmm.
makes the movie so much fun to experience, right? And then like I said, the twist of like no, but actually the girl is just as much of a badass as the
Hmm.
guy who's been saying is a badass, but
Yeah.
she's actually really badass too, and that's fun. Like
Hmm.
it doesn't take anything away from him. It's like oh, that's kind of cool too,
Yeah.
right? And it's just the coolness factor of this movie, like for me, is unbelievable. And that's why I like that scene, like, because it's just so ridiculous at the beginning. Like, they take over the plane and the other plane flies over and hooks
Hmm.
into it and like rips it open to like get the guys out. And the fact that he's like he let himself be captured as a guy who was gonna rat
Hmm.
on Bane, but then he's actually Bane. Like it's just like, oh,
Hmm.
it's like, man, that guy is so cool.
Yeah, well, and just so many of the little dialogue exchanges are so fun. Like, it's like, what would happen if we took that mask off? It's like, it would be extraordinarily painful for
For you.
you. Yeah, so I think like the performance wise, I think yes, I think he's very cool. I think he works really well as a physical foil for where Batman is at this point because he is the example of the real person Bruce Wayne inside the Batman costume has sustained a lot of injuries over the years. He is not at his physical peak anymore. And eventually, it seems inevitable that someone is going to come along who's going to beat the shit out of him.
Right.
And Alfred says, like, I see this coming, and you are walking right into it because it seems like there's some part of you that wants that to happen.
Yes.
And Bane is a great character for doing that. Although I will say, the actual moment of breaking his back feels kind of weak to me compared to the comic moment where it's originating from. Like
Okay.
I feel like they don't sell the actual move where it happens very well. Like it looks like yeah that would hurt, but it doesn't look like I am breaking Batman's back right now.
Okay.
It's not a big deal. It's just I just mean like that's an iconic comic book moment where if you look up the image of the comic book image of how it does and then you watch the shot in the movie, it feels kind of weak by comparison in my opinion.
Yeah,
But
I'll have to check that out. But yeah, well, and
but
so
oh
that's
yeah, go
kind of
ahead.
the other thing too with Bane is like, and again, why I was talking earlier about why I do love the Talia reveal so much, and again,
Mhm.
like because the escape thing is it feels like you're getting tricked into this whole like Bane is what could have happened to Batman if he didn't want to use if he used his anger side and not his good side, right? Like it's almost like trying to draw him as like if you took that same focus and all the same things, and that's why that escape scene like kind of fits with the ninja thing and like
Mm-hmm.
all that, and it's like, oh, this is where he could have gone, but then it's revealed that that's not who Bane is at all.
Yeah.
Like he's just a guy who's just wants to kick
Mm-hmm.
ass and take names, right? Like
Yeah.
he
I
doesn't really have, to your point of what your criticism was, he has no motivation. Like
well,
I feel
I
that was almost powerful because you get trapped in thinking his motivation is similar to Batman's.
here let me put forward this idea. Tom Hardy's version of Bane, but instead of what this movie does, Bane's deal is that he wants to be a crime lord. He wants to be a badass that everybody listens to him and does what he says, and he gets all of the spoils of doing all this crime stuff because he's so tough that nobody can tell him no. Versus this retread League of Shadows thing where we want Gotham to burn, except we also want them to suffer for 6 months. But also, we're presenting that to the people of Gotham like it's liberation somehow, even though we're actually just going to blow them up anyway. Like, all of that stuff feels like it weakens to me the elemental power of what Hardy is doing as the character.
I can totally see that. And so, and well, and here's one thing I thought of when you were talking and doing a really good job of like talking about Heath Ledger's character in Dark Knight
Mm-hmm.
that I had never thought of before is, were they trying to capture that same concept of like Heath Ledger just doing stuff, right? Like how you pointed out, like the Joker just does things that he likes,
Mm-hmm.
right? And then try to say that's eventually that's who Bane is a guy who just does stuff that he likes. It's just instead of
Mm-hmm.
he likes kicking ass and taking names, right? He doesn't have any greater motivation.
Mm-hmm.
And not saying that it's right, but maybe that is kind of where, from the writing standpoint, like maybe that was the flaw, is like, oh, this really worked, and this sort of,
Mm-hmm.
that the bad guy is not motivated in a classical way, but then they put all these weaves of like, we made you believe that he was for a long time, and then we pull the rug out and it's not,
Mm-hmm.
and he's not. And they thought that was really good, and
Yeah.
I can
Like,
see why you could, why you're
well,
saying that weakens it, and I agree with it. I
I
think I'm so compelled by the way the movie unrolls that I don't
yeah,
care.
I will say I will agree that the Talia reveal, it turning out that Bane was not the one that escaped, but rather the protector that stayed behind. Like that does not. I have no problem with that. That you know, I don't have any issue with that piece of it. I agree that I don't think it weakens his character. I think it's really not even a Bane problem so much as it's a League of Shadows problem.
Yeah, I can see
Um,
that. Yeah,
it's the problem is we get a lot of Tom Hardy doing these big speeches that sound cool in the moment, but I just feel like they don't add up to anything that makes sense. I don't know what he's actually trying to do, and I think it's because they're trying to take this super tough but also really smart badass and trying to also put the League of Shadows stuff on top of that, and they don't actually fit very well because
yeah,
that's
that
not the
makes
League of
sense.
Shadows deal. That, like, their whole thing is supposed to be trying to do it from the shadows. That's their whole deal,
Right.
you know.
Whereas he's rolling into football stadiums in a tank or whatever the thing was,
Yeah.
like, and that scene's awesome, but
Yeah,
but it's
right.
not
Yeah,
League of
so like,
Shadows.
yeah,
Yeah,
again, that, and so that's I think I think that maybe it is just trying to combine Bane with the League of Shadows, which again, I won't say I'm an expert on comic book Bane, but I'm pretty sure he's not a League of Shadows guy. That was never his deal. He's basically just a badass crime lord guy, and his mask is basically because he's kind of like luchador flavored.
right.
Um,
Like he, well, I think that's why, like,
like
we're
because his
supposed to think that he's like Batman gone wrong because he's doing the same thing, right? His
well,
mask is
and his big thing in the comic is that he is so tough, like he's strong already, but he also uses this like enhancement drug called Venom. And there's a whole plot line with Batman of like where like if you used this drug, you could be even stronger. And what if doesn't that help you more? But it's also kind of addictive and it makes you at risk of losing control. And that's what Batman can't risk. But Bane is the guy who will just say, give me more of that stuff. Give me all you got. And so that's like one of Bane's big things. But I think as he's developed over the years, they made him more like he's like super strong, but he's also really smart, and he's very tough in both ways. And so, but he like his deal was never that he was the League of Shadows that wanted to make the world burn so that it could be rebuilt from the ashes, and that needs to happen to Gotham specifically, but not right now, but in 6 months instead. And even in the movie, it's revealed that that's not even his plan. It's actually Talia's plan, and he's just helping her,
Yeah.
right? Um, and so I like him, and I think like when he's on screen, I'm enjoying myself, but I just feel like the the actual plot, the scheme doesn't actually make sense, and for different reasons. Because like in Batman Begins, we joked about the whole like microwave emitter evaporating water in pipes, 100 feet away without doing anything in between. Um,
Right.
but that's like technical stuff, right? Like it's a technical. You still understand why, if that worked, they would want to do that. They would want to make the city, destroy itself in a spasm of fear, right? Whereas with Bane, it just sort of feels like it's the equivalent of, when we talked about Fight Club, we talked about that scene where they hold the convenience store guy at gunpoint and take his driver's license and just like, if we check
Yeah.
back in 6 months and you're not in vet school or whatever. It's like doing that if Tyler plans to kill him anyway, no matter what he did. It's like, why even bother with going through that whole process if you're just going to kill him anyway? That's what the plot here feels like to me.
Yeah.
Um, I will say,
I'm not going to disagree
oh
with you
yeah,
on any of
yeah,
this.
sure.
I'm not going to say like, oh no,
Well,
this
and
plot makes
so
a
I
ton of
I
sense.
think I think it's just clear. It's just something that that aspect of it bothers me more than you, and that's fair.
Yeah.
Um, but I guess what I want to agree with you on is that I think Tom Hardy as Bane is cool. I think the voice is fun. I think the mask is maybe a little over designed, but whatever. Especially just because they really never explain at any point like what does it do exactly? Why does he need it? Like he got beat up somehow or something, and that's why he needs a super extra duper fancy mask that does something, helps him breathe, I guess. It's like it just they really don't make any effort whatsoever to explain that, and yet they have a couple of lines about it anyway. Um, that's fine. I don't even need to. Um, Other things I really do like about Dark Knight Rises. I really like I think it's such an interesting way to take the story of dealing in a grounded way with the idea that all of the injuries that Bruce Wayne has taken over the years and the increasing difficulty of trying to sell all that as the result of extreme sports, and the fact that he is literally like walks with a limp now and he can't like that. I like them really dealing with that, and because it's not how Batman has typically been treated, because typically with comic book stories you want Batman to go forever, right? And so by building in this idea that look man, you're a human being with a physical shelf life. You cannot keep doing this forever. And having the movie really reckon with that, I thought is very interesting. I like Anne Hathaway as Catwoman.
Yes. Very
She's
good.
lots of fun. I like her just generally, but I think they make some fun decisions with her. It's a little bit silly, but I like the goggles that look like cat ears when she puts them up on her head. I think that's fun.
Yep.
Um, I like
Well,
that.
they do that a couple of times
Yeah.
because she has like he first encounters her at like the masquerade
Mm-hmm.
ball, and she's got like the mask that
Mm-hmm.
has like the bow that ties in the back, and the bow comes up
Yeah.
like two cat ears. Like it was very clever how they
Mm-hmm.
kind of like roll her into that. I thought
Yeah,
that was
well,
fun.
I like the introduction of her character, where at first it's like, oh, she's just uh, the maid who is, oh no, she's tasked with going up to the strange quarters of where the mysterious Wayne is up there, and then we realize, oh wait, no, she's doing something up there, and then just how that all develops, I think, is a lot of fun. Um, I like too that it's the sort of thing where she was hired to steal Bruce Wayne's fingerprints, but decided to go ahead and help herself to the necklace anyway while she was in there. That stuff's fun, and that she put it on immediately. She didn't even like have it in a bag or anything. She just put it on. That's
Yeah.
fun. I like her character. I think it's the movie doesn't necessarily work very hard to sell us on why she would be as interested in him as she ends up being, but I don't mind that so much. I think it's fine ultimately. I like the whole element of having her make the selfish sort of mercenary decision of like, well, you're going to lose anyway. I might as well be on the winning side. Betrayal, but then feeling bad about it immediately and then having to kind of live with that for a while until he comes back. But that when he comes back, he basically doesn't waste any time at all on being mad at her about it because he just understands. Like, look, you screwed me over, but I can tell that you regret it. Here's a chance to make it up. Not to me, but to the city.
Yep.
I like all of that stuff with her. Um,
And I think we should also talk about Joseph Gordon-Levitt.
yeah. Hmm.
I I I like his whole, like, again, as we're talking about, there's like fun characters that are in, like good characters in this movie, because he does a couple of things, right? Like he's almost like representative of like the idealism of like the first movie that Christian Bale and Gary Oldman had, of like
Hmm.
what they were trying to do. Like he's like the young guy who still feels like they used to feel
Hmm.
as they're getting to your point, like they're coming to the end of the Batman thing.
Yeah.
He doesn't, he's like with us, he doesn't want it to come to an end. Like he's the one that real figures out he's Batman, goes to him and is like begging him to come back. He's like
Hmm.
he wants all that still, which is why he packs his bags, and like as we find out his full name is
Yeah.
Robin Lake, and shows up there. And and I feel like not only is he just good during the movie, and he has some great scenes, like in the
Hmm.
thing with the buses and the bridges
Yeah.
and all
Hmm.
that stuff. Like he's got some really cool action scenes that sell us as like, hey, this guy can is capable of like kind of doing these things as much as he just also wants this to happen.
Hmm.
But then it kind of gets to the theme we've kind of talked about earlier, which is one of the things I actually think this movie does really well, is that it sets it up for, because again, they've called him Robin, he shows up at the Batcave, like there's a sort of like, oh, there could be one next.
Hmm.
But the movie is self-contained, where
Yeah.
like just our imaginations of like what could happen next is enough without another movie.
Well, so here's the
Like
thing
that's
is,
pretty
yeah,
clever. That's like
yeah.
that's
I
good writing,
I will agree because I think in some ways I'm still what I would call an MCU fan. I'm to some extent a defender, even as the MCU has become kind of a bloated monstrosity in a lot of ways. I like them. I've still seen all of them. I will probably continue to see all of them for some time. But in some ways, having those like end credit sequences and having everything connect together plays into some of the worst tendencies of comic books, which can be really fun for someone who is read in on everything, but starts making it feel like See, like the thing is with the Marvel Cinematic Universe movies is the truth is you really can go see just about any of them without having seen any of the others and you won't be lost. The movie will explain what you need to know. But it's the MCU as an entity's own fault for making it seem to people like you do have to have seen everything. It's their fault. They did that to themselves. And so I think it is the expectations that have been trained on the early waves of the MCU that made people watch the end of Dark Knight Rises and assume that must be because they were definitely planning to do a sequel with Joseph Gordon-Levitt as Robin becoming the new Batman. When I don't think Nolan ever had any interest in doing that. Like I
Right.
think that he wanted it to just feel like this is an ending in some ways, but
But a
the
new
story
beginning.
of Gotham could continue, and it's just like it's an ending that suggests that there is a possible future for these characters without it having to be like this is a plan and now we know that Joseph Gordon-Levitt's got a 3-picture deal or whatever, right? Like because I don't think Nolan ever planned to do that, but people watch this sort of thing today, and even when this came out, um, with in their heads all the news about how like you know Marvel has contracted this one person to be the villain 7 movies from now, and then they run into trouble with stuff like Jonathan Majors, who is going to be the next big Thanos equivalent, and then he had ran into some trouble, and now they don't want him to be it anymore. Except they've already laid a lot of groundwork to support him being in it, and so actually they've made a problem for themselves because now they can't easily extract him without changing a whole bunch of plans. But it's I what I guess I'm just getting at is I also like that, and I don't think it ever meant that they were really planning to do a sequel with him.
Yeah.
I like that I think they did a better job selling him as a character that mattered throughout the story, even before we get the Robin, middle name reveal.
Mhm. Yep.
Um, uh, because so like by contrast, like I kind of touched on this earlier, I think they do a better job with explaining why he is a character that we spend time with than we do with uh, Catherine Tate, aka Talia al Ghul. Um, I feel like you wait. Every time she's on screen in the movie, you're waiting to find out what her actual deal is. Um,
Yep.
because I think that what they were maybe hoping is that she would just feel like the person who could maybe be um, a new Rachel if Bruce could just open himself up again. But then they've also got Anne Hathaway in there doing Catwoman, and they don't ever do any tension between those two characters. So, like, how do they want us to? They don't ever set those two as opposing foils, which leads us to just feel like, well, she's got to be in this movie for a reason. They're spending a lot of time on her.
Yep.
And so it's not that, when I watched this, that I expected her to turn out to be Talia al Ghul, but it did feel like when it finally happened, it's like, oh, okay. Well, finally. That explains it, except that also it means that her plan, wait, what was her plan? Is this whole thing that we've just watched play out, is that what was supposed to happen? Because it seems a little messy. But I like, and again, I don't necessarily think this is the fault of the actress. Marion Cotillard, I think, is the
Yep.
actress. Yeah, because she's been in other Nolan stuff, and she's been in lots of things that I think she's fine in. I don't think she's bad in this. I just think that she is given like her character is kind of nothing until she is turned out to be Talia, but then Talia really only is that cool backstory reveal, right? Like what else is there to her character once we get that part? Now that's a cool bit. Like all of this stuff with that cool prison. Well, okay, let me. I'll nitpick that the whole super difficult thing about climbing out mostly just amounts to that one point where you have to do a big jump. Like, I wish that it looked harder other than that one spot. Because it seems like people kind of get to that one spot pretty regularly and then just give up at that one point. And I feel like that maybe could have been better. But by and large, the whole concept of it's really difficult, and most people don't bother because you really are at risk of hurting yourself or dying by even attempting, and it's actually super hard. But then turning out to be that the way that you do it is by doing it without a rope, where it's all or nothing. You have to be willing to risk death, really, to do it instead of kind of going halfway. I like that. And I like the reveal that it turns out that she's the one that actually did that, right? Like, that stuff I like. But I just sort of feel like, what is her character after that? Like, is she. We get stuff about, like, well, Bane was excommunicated from the League of Shadows because, like, he was too extreme somehow, except we don't really ever understand what it was that he theoretically did that got him excommunicated. But then also, like, she's trying to take on Raj's original mission, except different, and, like, just none of that stuff ever gets anything solid for us to stand on, and it bothers me.
Makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. But certainly, there's some cool stuff. Like, you mentioned, like, I think it was surprising to have football be the sport that they chose to, incorporate into the action set piece in this way. But I think that sequence is pretty fun. Um, it's silly, but in a way that I enjoy, the whole bit where the guy who's doing the long run while the football field is collapsing behind him, and he doesn't even realize until he gets to the end zone. I think that's pretty good. I
Yeah.
like that. um, I like some of the stuff that is just feels like, now that we've got the bones of the story in, what are the sorts of little bits of nonsense that would happen in between, like Scarecrow taking over the courthouse and sentencing people to death or exile. And, if you choose exile, or if you choose death, it's death by exile.
Yes.
That stuff's
Forgot
fun.
about
I like
that.
all of
Yeah.
that. Uh, and it is another point of complete nonsense, though, that by blowing up one barrier in one tunnel, all of these police that have been stuck in the tunnels for months all come out and their uniforms look nice, and then they all march down the street together. Sure. Okay. Yeah, all right.
Yep.
um but yeah, like, I think that the movie does some interesting things, and there's some things about it that I really like, but I just really struggle with feeling any kind of a real thematic coherence out of anything the villains are doing. Like, other than Bane just being the guy who is so tough that Batman, in the state that he's let himself get in, can't beat him. And him having to sort of rediscover himself in order to win, but realizing that what he has to do for that is be willing to give it all, basically. Right? Like, I think that piece works well, but there's also a lot of screen time spent on other stuff that doesn't work as well for me.
Yeah, I agree with all that, and I've kind of explained the parts I
All
really
right.
like.
Yeah,
So,
I
yeah.
yeah, I don't I hope I'm not coming across as, like, trying to harsh your enjoyment of it, but
No, I think we can both agree that it's three movies that
mhm.
last between 8 and 9 hours total. Because they're almost all close. They're all 2 plus, if not close to 3 hour
I
movies.
think they're all 2.5 plus. Let's see. Oh, well, so Batman Begins is 2 hours 20 minutes.
I think the other two are like 2:45, if not more.
Yeah, The Dark Knight is 2:32, and then Dark Knight Rises is 2:45. Yeah.
Yeah, so you're at 8 hours
Mm-hmm.
essentially, almost 8 hours in three movies. But despite all the things that we could pick at, like I think we both agree that it's a fun time to spend
Mm-hmm.
watching movies, right? Like there's nothing where you're like, I wish I hadn't watched that,
Well,
right?
the other thing that's interesting about it is that as a trilogy, it is one of the rare trilogies that is allowed to kind of like, even as we continue to tell Batman stories, no one is trying to continue or affect these Batman stories, right?
Yeah,
Like Batman as a concept keeps going, but no one is trying to like make a sequel. Someone else is not trying to make a sequel to Dark Knight Rises,
right.
right? And it's so it feels contained in that way, which I find kind of refreshing to look back on just because so much of superhero media outside of that still feels like everything needs to be cross connected and tie in to one another and all
Right.
of that sort of thing. Because, um, I'm definitely not really a Snyder fan. And so I feel like the Man of Steel, Superman versus Batman, and Justice League movies are personally, I think, pretty disastrous. I don't like them.
Yeah,
Like, even where I have complaints about some of the elements of the Nolan Batman movies, I would say I like all three movies.
yeah.
Um, Whereas, and they feel like they are trying to say something with the character, and it's not always the thing that I would want them to say. And or I guess I'm overstating that because Snyder I think is also, but mostly what he seems to be trying to say is Batman is cool. I you know what I don't want to get into that actually because
I don't
there's a
either.
lot of people who like those movies again. And I don't want to be like dismissive of the people who like them. It's just a very different take on those characters than the ones that I personally enjoy. But by comparison, I really liked the Matt Reeves The Batman
I
movie.
did too.
And I like it as a contrast not only to the Snyderverse take, but also this one. But even it is because in some ways it's more of a return to comic booky elements than it has like it, I think one of the biggest things that I really like about it is trying to make Batman not just be vengeance and the night, but a hero who's trying to help people as opposed to only look cool while he's punishing the bad. And I liked the movie explicitly reckoning with that, like the fact that he saves a guy from getting mugged, but that guy is just as terrified of him because he looks like a nightmare, right? It's like this
Yep.
extremely dangerous guy just beat up those other dangerous guys and he's in a weird costume. I'm supposed to just say, "Oh good, I'm glad you're here." Um but and then also recognizing that, and like Dark Knight actually touches on this just a little bit with the copycats, right? I think it doesn't really dig too deep into that, and the Batman does that more because that's the Riddler character's kind of whole deal is the Riddler assumes that if he got to meet Batman, they would be best bros because they're doing the same thing, right? We're trying to punish the corrupt of Gotham City. How are we not doing exactly the same thing? And for Batman to be able to see that and understand, I maybe need to take a look at how I'm approaching this if people like that think we're doing the same thing. And for him to get to that point of saying, I need to do this differently if I want to be a hero instead of just a vigilante.
Right.
I think that's interesting.
Yeah, I like it a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I still think it's interesting that you have, by inaction or design, refused to engage with almost any of the Marvel Cinematic Universe movies. just because I feel like you would like them if you let them, you let yourself. I know you watch Black Panther, but just like we've talked about this
I
before.
feel like a lot of the things that you described here are part of the reason why. Is that like
Mm.
I get that they're self-contained, but it feels like there's just too
I
much.
I get it. I do. And I think it is a real problem. And it's part of why I think the Marvel Cinematic Universe is in a um, course correction phase right now. But we'll see. But in any case, what do we want to do next time?
I had floated the one idea about doing all the Oceans movies.
That's certainly something we could do. I had floated the idea that there, like we did with Martin Scorsese, I think there are a lot of filmmakers whom we've seen one or two of their movies, but they have actually a lot more other movies that we haven't seen.
Mhm.
That might be interesting to talk about. And Orson Welles was one example of that. But I don't know if you're not necessarily feeling Orson Welles, or if you don't have another specific idea, we could certainly do the Ocean's movies.
Let's, for simplicity, let's do those
Okay.
and let's come up with some ideas to match the concept you're talking about so that we can do that next.
Okay. Well, which I take to mean that you're maybe not as interested in Orson Welles, which is fine if that's the case.
We we could do Orson Welles, but I kind of want to think of like, would it be him or would we be like we do a couple of his movies and a couple of somebody else's, or do we?
Okay.
Yeah, I
Fair enough. We
just
could spend. We'll watch the Ocean's movies, which I guess we would want to probably include both the original Rat Pack version and then also Ocean's 8.
yes.
All
Let's
right.
just do all of them.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're pretty
Uh,
pretty
I'm
easy to.
I'm guessing we're not necessarily going to have a lot to say about the original one. If I recall, my last viewing of it is it's interesting in comparison, but not great.
Correct.
Yeah.
But
Anyway,
I just
we'll
feel like
see.
we should do
Yeah.
it if
No.
we're gonna do it.
To put it
Yeah.
all in context, I think it's
Yep.
worthwhile.
And then we will come up with we will look at Orson Welles' filmography and come up with a couple of ideas each
Mm-hmm.
of some ones that maybe we'd like to watch of his that aren't necessarily the ones that we watch all the time,
All right.
and then think if there's anybody else that kind of fits that we either include or don't if we just stick with Orson Welles.
I think even whether that's the approach we take or not, I would kind of, when we were going through the AFI list, we spent a lot of time watching old classic movies, and I sort of feel like we haven't done that in a little while. Old Hollywood.
Yep, that's fine. Yeah,
Hmm.
let's make sure that we do
Yeah.
something along those lines
All
for
right.
next.
So, but for next time, Ocean's movies. So thank you everybody for listening and/or watching, and we will be back. So watch good movies.
Good movies. All right.